Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all again here. My name is John Binder. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Climate, Air, and Energy here at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Welcome to the third in our series of webinars regarding New York State's economy-wide Cap and Invest program. For today's webinar, we are going to be covering some of the same information that we covered in the first two webinars, but with a focus on looking at these issues from the perspective of liquid fuels for today's session. So again, we are going to be raising some of the same questions and topics on which we are seeking input with that focus on liquid fuels. Just like in our previous two sessions, we are seeking to stimulate thinking amongst stakeholders and to describe the issues on which we are soliciting input. We hope to be able to have some time at the end to be able to address some questions, but we will not necessarily have time to address all of your questions. As a reminder, these webinars are just part of the extensive outreach that we plan to do. We do understand how important this program is in terms of meeting the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our focus in this entire series of webinars throughout June is really to ensure that stakeholders of various backgrounds and perspectives are well positioned to provide us with robust input on a range of specific topics, including through a website that you'll hear us mention a lot today, which is capandinvest.ny.gov. So just like with the previous two webinars, we've budgeted up to 2 hours for today's webinar, but let's start by, again, discussing the procedure for today. Ryan?
Thank you, John. So as an attendee, I wanted to let you know that you will not be able to unmute or turn on your video. Attendees will, however, be able to submit questions via the Q&A feature. Select clarifying questions will be answered by panelists. If you are having tech issues and would like help, you can also submit a request via the Q&A feature. We will do our best to assist you. If you can't hear the presentation, you can configure your audio settings by clicking the arrow in the audio box. This will allow you to change the speaker settings. If you're having connectivity issues, you can also press switch audio to phone, and this will allow you to listen to audio of the webinar through your phone. Today's webinar will also offer live captioning and translation services. You can turn on closed captioning for the presentation at the bottom of the screen. You can also change the language of the captions by pressing the translation to setting. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the webinar recording will be posted on the New York State website at that website that John just mentioned, capandinvest.ny.gov. And I will turn it back to you, John. Next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Ryan, as always, for walking us through the procedures for today's meeting. But again, especially thanks to all of you for joining us here today. Just like with our first couple of webinars that happened earlier this week and last week, we do have several staff members here today from both DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, as well as our partners at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. So we are excited again to be here and to hear to receive your input as we design the details of the state's economy-wide Cap and Invest program, which is really to meet the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which you'll hear us refer to as both the CLCPA or the Climate Act. But again, before we get into the details of today's program and some of the specific issues that we're seeking input on, we did think it was once again important to remind everybody of the process that we plan to follow for the development and implementation of this program. We want to once again emphasize that this series of webinars is just the beginning of the outreach process for this program. And because we are early in the process of designing the details of this program, the time is right to hear input from stakeholders like all of you. Well, as I mentioned, we do hope to have some time to answer questions from participants at the end of today's session. We will not necessarily have definitive answers to all of your questions. And as we mentioned before, that really is intentional and by design. And that's because at this stage in program development, we have not made final decisions because we want to hear from all types of stakeholders, including all of you, before we finalize program elements. We know that it's most important to get this right following stakeholder input. So moving on to how you can follow the process. On the next slide, we know that many folks here are very much interested in following this process. So if you have not already done so, please do sign up for the Climate Act mailing list. Webinar slide decks and recordings, as Ryan mentioned, will all be posted on the Cap and Invest website. Again, that's capandinvest.ny.gov. So the materials and recording for last week's initial session, they're already available up on that website. The slides from Tuesday's natural gas focused session are also posted there. The website also has preliminary information on each of the rulemakings that we are developing here at DEC and NYSERDA. The website includes a series of questions that we're seeking input on, including reiterating many of the same questions that we're going to be outlining again today in this session. We will be sending email updates to the mailing list to alert the public of major updates to the information on the website. And you can actually submit comments directly on the website by clicking the Submit Comments button. You can type your feedback directly into the comment intake platform, or if you prefer, you can upload your feedback as an attachment. NYSERDA and DEC have developed a template form to provide feedback to aid in organizing your feedback at this stage of program development. You can also download that directly from the website. If you do have questions about this process and how to comment, please do enter them into the Q&A feature, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Moving on to the agenda on the next slide. Again, we budgeted up to 2 hours for today's session. We might not take up all of that time, but as part of today's presentation, we do intend to provide a brief summary of the Climate Act, again, the background that led us to this point in developing an economy-wide cap and invest program to achieve its requirements. And then we'll provide a very brief overview of what an economy-wide cap and invest program is. And we'll spend a little bit of time on what is different about New York's program based on our current thinking, as compared to other similar programs in other jurisdictions. That does include the key concept of obligated and non-obligated sources and emissions. This is going to be something of a repeat for those of you that were here with us for either of our 2 previous webinars, but we do recognize that we might have some different participants today. But I do want to emphasize there will be some new material today, particularly on this point about obligated and non-obligated emissions. So there will be some additional clarification and graphics to hopefully help further illustrate and clarify that point. But from there, we will get into, again, some more detailed questions about the various design elements of each of the regulations that are under development to support this program and how they might be relevant for today's webinar's focus topic, which is liquid fuels. So after that, we will conclude by, again, discussing next steps in the process, including future stakeholder webinars and where stakeholders can provide comments. Just as with our first 2 webinars, we do have a lot of content to cover. We welcome clarifying questions on content throughout the presentation. We also welcome more substantive questions and input. We're going to save our responses from most of these questions to the end of the presentation portion of today's session. We might not be able to answer all of your questions, both to cover everything, but also because, again, as I will continue to emphasize, at this point in the regulatory process, we do not necessarily have specific answers to the questions that you're posing. We want to hear your input before we make final decisions about what will be in the regulations. So we're here today as part of the process of seeking that input from stakeholders, which again, I told you you're going to get tired of hearing this, but you can provide that input by going to capandinvest.ny.gov. And we'll consider all of that input as we develop our draft regulations. Moving on to the CLCPA overview on the next slide. This is again why we are all here today, to reduce emissions and to meet the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. This law sets the state on a path towards a carbon neutral economy, and it mandates at least an 85% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's from 1990 levels. It also has a near-term requirement for 2030 to reduce emissions by 40%. And to help achieve these directives, the law also mandates 100% emissions-free electricity generation by 2040 and 70% renewable electricity by 2030, along with other energy generation and storage requirements. So it's important to remember, though, that in addition to these emission reduction requirements and energy generation requirements, the Climate Act also contains critical commitments to climate justice and a just transition. These are requirements that are set out in the law, but these climate justice and equity principles are also key for us at DEC and NYSERDA as we design the program. Moving on to the next slide again, with this is about the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. One of the requirements of the law is for DEC to prepare an annual statewide greenhouse gas emissions report, or an inventory. This report covers all emission sources in the state, looking back from 1990 up through 2 years prior, and it includes emissions from sources within the state, as well as those that are associated with imported electricity and fossil fuels. DEC issued our most recent annual report back in December of last year, December of 2022, and that included emissions data through 2020. Of course, we all know that that was not a typical year because of the impact of the pandemic. So here, we're providing a graphical depiction of the composition of the current greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So the graph on the left side shows the economic sectors and their relative contribution to the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. The graph on the right-hand side shows where we were in 1990, where we were in 2019, and where we need to go in 2030 and 2050, as required under the CLCPA. I mentioned how the law has the 40% reduction and 85% reduction requirements. The law also required us to adopt a regulation at DEC, which we did in a regulation called Part 496. That took those percentage reduction requirements and translated those into volume or mass-based limits. That's how you got those two right-hand side, the blue. We have 246 million metric tons. For 2050, we have 62 million metric tons. Those are limits in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents that we have to achieve in 2030 and 2050. And these are the limits that we are seeking to ensure that we will actually achieve through the implementation of this program, the Cap and Invest program. So moving on to the next slide, before launching into the details of the program itself, we did want to remind everybody again how we got here. So first, the Climate Action Council, which was part of the Climate Act, recommended an economy-wide Cap and Invest program in the final scoping plan that was issued at the end of 2022. The Council recognized the Cap and Invest program as the most cost-effective means of achieving the emission limits that are set forth in the Climate Act. This was after an extensive process in developing the scoping plan over the course of several years. And you can go to climate.ny.gov to read the entire scoping plan. For purposes of this conversation, I would draw your attention to Chapter 17 of that final scoping plan, which addresses economy-wide strategies. That chapter of the scoping plan provides, I think, helpful context to our discussion today, including the background and the criteria for evaluation of various economy-wide strategies that really led to this recommendation to do a Cap and Invest program. It also includes proposed program design elements that serve as informative recommendations for all of us here at DEC and NYSERDA, and as the starting point for the state's Cap and Invest program. Consistent with these recommendations coming out of the scoping plan, Governor Hochul announced the development of an economy-wide Cap and Invest program in her 2023 State of the State address. And the governor directed us at DEC and NYSERDA to establish this program. Finally, the recently enacted state budget from last month advanced this program further, including through the creation of the financial foundation that's required to support the economy-wide Cap and Invest program. So that's what we're doing here today. We're developing this program to meet the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, along with it, making sure that we are achieving the equity and climate justice requirements that are set forth in the Climate Act. Moving on to the next slide. The governor, in her State of the State address, also outlined several key principles for us at DEC and NYSERDA as we develop the mechanics of this program. First and foremost is affordability, which is why a portion of allowance proceeds from this program will go directly back to New Yorkers to help address energy affordability. And of course, again, that was one of the key parts of the budget that passed just last month. The Climate Act also requires that at least 35%, with a goal of 40% or more, of clean energy and energy efficiency investments benefit disadvantaged communities. That will also remain a key principle, along with other program features that are intended to address climate justice. In addition to affordability and climate justice, other key principles that are guiding our development of this program include climate leadership, which is really referring to making sure that we are designing this program in a manner that facilitates linking of our program with similar ones in other jurisdictions. We also are going to make sure we are creating jobs and preserving economic competitiveness for the state. And finally, funding a sustainable future through ambitious clean energy investments. On the next slide, I just want to reiterate here that a primary purpose of this program is to ensure that the state actually achieves the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next several months, is conducting this type of pre-proposal stakeholder outreach with various groups regarding the details of this program. Again, this is the third in our series of webinars. We're trying to get input on the regulatory elements as well as other elements of this program. So I also want to talk about the illustrative chart here that's on the right-hand side of the screen. That shows how the maximum amount of allowable greenhouse gas emissions in the state will decline each year. Again, since the purpose of the program is ensuring that we achieve the statewide emission limits, or at least one of the key purposes of the program, we already know the endpoints. We already know that in 2030 and 2050, we know what our cap and what our emission limits have to be. That's the 40% by 2030 and the 85% by 2050 emission reduction requirements that are set forth in the law. What we don't know yet is the precise starting point, and as well as the downward slope. Those are things that have to be determined, the precise trajectory of that downward slope to get to those 2030 and 2050 points. Moving on to the next slide with some details about how this program will work. A key feature of this program is the legal requirement for large sources of greenhouse gas emissions to purchase what we refer to as emission allowances to cover each ton of greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with their activities. So in order to comply with the regulatory program, at the end of a relevant time period, obligated sources will have to provide to DEC emission allowances in a quantity to cover their associated emissions. Emission allowances that are provided to DEC for compliance purposes, we sometimes refer to that as surrendering allowances. Those allowances are permanently retired, meaning they can never again be utilized by a source to cover a ton of emissions. And because the overall amount of these emission allowances that are issued by the state is limited or capped, that's the cap portion of cap and invest, because that overall amount is limited and it declines each year, that gives us the legal and regulatory assurances that greenhouse gas emissions will in fact decrease to meet our statewide greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. Most of these emission allowances will be sold by the state through auctions, which again will generate proceeds. And a portion of those proceeds, roughly a third, will go back to New Yorkers to address energy affordability. The remainder of those proceeds, roughly 2/3, will go towards critical investments in efforts to assure that we're transitioning to a clean energy economy, things that further reduce emissions, clean transportation, other types of complementary projects and programs that are reducing emissions. Again, this was further advanced as part of the last month's budget that passed for the state. I should also mention that the budget calls for a climate affordability study process, which is going to provide recommendations regarding that 1/3 of the funds and how those are most used in the most impactful way to benefit New Yorkers. And then moving on to the next slide, this is a visual representation of how the program works. It's really another depiction of hopefully helping to summarize what I just described. So first, the program is going to set an legally enforceable limit. That's the cap on emissions. The annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions that may be emitted each year in the state. That cap is going to decline each year to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. And in the top right corner, large-scale greenhouse gas emission sources and distributors of heating and transportation fuels will be required to purchase or obtain these emission allowances. These entities will be legally obligated to provide to DEC emission allowances to cover each ton of greenhouse gases they emit. Because these allowances will be primarily auctioned by the state, they will generate proceeds, which will then be utilized for various purposes, including that roughly 1/3, 2/3 split, meaning 1/3 goes directly back to New Yorkers to address energy affordability. 2/3 is utilized for projects and actions that further reduce emissions. And finally, always at the top of our minds when we're designing this program is prioritizing frontline disadvantaged communities, communities that we know have long suffered from pollution as a result of long-standing environmental injustice. So this program will help to ensure emission reductions in these communities. Of course, this focus on disadvantaged communities and ensuring that there is no disproportionate burden on disadvantaged communities is both a key principle for us, but also a legal requirement set forth in the law. Moving on to the next slide. With that background, I did want to highlight again a few additional items before I turn it back over to our expert staff that are leading the development and the details of these regulations. So I mentioned the statewide greenhouse gas emission inventory report that DEC issues each year as required by the law. This is an overall inventory or estimate of statewide greenhouse gas emissions. It does not always include specific information reported by individual emission sources. Because of that, because not all individual sources of greenhouse gas emissions are currently required to report emissions information to us at DEC, we think that additional emission reporting requirements are necessary to support the Cap and Invest program. So we do expect that certain individual emission sources will be required to report emissions information to DEC. We also expect that the number of entities that are reporting entities, meaning they have an obligation to report emissions information to us, we expect that that number will be greater than the number of entities that have an allowance compliance obligation under the Cap and Invest regulation. We think this is necessary to support the integrity of emission allowance determinations and to support the integrated reporting platforms from multiple programs, and I think also to help identify and help inform future regulatory or other actions that we want to take to reduce emissions. So turning to the regulatory framework for this program, to implement the inner workings of New York's Cap and Invest program, which again, many of us have taken to referring to as NYSERDA, NYCI, New York Cap and Invest. Many of us are going to be using NYSERDA as shorthand to refer to this program. DEC and NYSERDA are working to develop 3 parallel regulations. The first will impose mandatory reporting requirements. That's what I just mentioned on the previous slide. The second will be a DEC regulation that sets forth the requirements for sources to comply with the Cap and Invest program, the obligation primarily being providing allowances to DEC to cover emissions. And the last will be NYSERDA's regulation that sets forth the details about allowance auctions and market participation. Taken together, these 3 regulations will serve to ensure that the state meets the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits that are established in the Climate Act, and that we are doing so in a manner consistent with the Climate Action Council's recommendations from the scoping plan and the principles that Governor Hochul outlined for us. Moving on to the next slide, and we'll soon be getting to some of the new material that I teased at the beginning for those of us who are joining us again for a repeated performance. Some distinguishing elements of the NYSERDA program, right? So we do know that several other jurisdictions have established Cap and Invest programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Our program is going to be similar, but not identical to many of these other programs. So when referring to many of these other jurisdictions, we know that there's California, Washington State, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which New York is participating in. We do want to keep in mind that these are not exclusive. These are not the only programs that we are considering as we design this NYSERDA program in New York. But one key distinguishing element of the NYSERDA program in New York compared to these other programs is that New York's program is intended to cover all statewide greenhouse gas emissions as defined in the law, as set forth in that Part 496 regulation I mentioned, and in the annual statewide greenhouse gas emission inventory. So a primary feature of this program to ensure that it is truly economy-wide is the designation of what we refer to as obligated and non-obligated emissions. This was a concept that was initially proposed through the Climate Action Council process and in the final scoping plan. We do recognize, as we mentioned last time, that this is a somewhat new and complex concept. And that's why we're going to try to get at some additional materials shortly to hopefully help further illustrate and clarify this point. But first, under NYSERDA, both emission types, meaning first, so-called obligated emissions, and second, non-obligated emissions, both of these will be covered by the program. Because all emissions must be accounted for under this program and with the emissions cap. This is going to help ensure, again, that the program is truly economy-wide and that the state meets its emission reduction requirements. Obligated emissions and sources would have to surrender allowances for their emissions, similar to requirements in other emissions trading programs. But because not every single ton of emissions and every single individual source of emissions could really conceivably have a compliance obligation. We also need a mechanism for addressing non-obligated emissions. So these non-obligated emissions or sectors would have their emissions calculated and allowances retired on their behalf by the state. And emissions retired for non-obligated sources would be deducted from the overall cap. They'd be permanently retired. They would no longer be available in the system. Moving on to the next slide, because we did get a lot of questions about this feature of the program during our first 2 webinars. And since, again, this is a critical component of NYSERDA, we did want to take a little bit of additional time to provide some additional graphics and discussion to help illustrate this key concept of the program. On this first image here, we wanted to provide some potential examples of what might be non-obligated sources or categories. Again, we've heard lots of requests for examples during our first 2 webinars. It is important to emphasize that these are illustrative examples only, as again, we have not made any final determinations regarding which sectors or sources would be non-obligated. Some potential examples, as illustrated here, might include aviation emissions, direct emissions from livestock, and very small individual sources of emissions that are below established emissions thresholds. For example, an individual homeowner or renter would not be expected to have a compliance obligation, although the majority of these emissions could be addressed through an obligation on a fuel supplier. Moving to the next image here. What you see here is that, again, as we have emphasized, all emissions from all sources economy-wide covered by the CLCPA would go into the starting cap. This includes emissions from both obligated sources and non-obligated sources. In other words, the starting cap is the sum total of both obligated sources emissions and non-obligated sources emissions. Moving on to the next cartoon, if you will. Non-obligated sources, as the name suggests, would not have an allowance compliance obligation for their emissions under this program. Although, as mentioned previously, some of these sources could have an emissions reporting obligation. But instead of having an allowance compliance obligation on these sources, each year, DEC would be setting aside this bin of allowances in an amount that covers emissions from non-obligated sources. As the red X is emphasizing, these allowances are permanently retired by the state and thus not available to obligated sources. On the next graphic here, which hopefully helps to summarize the overall approach. First, to determine the annual allowance budget or the maximum amount of emission allowances that are available to obligated sectors and entities each year, DEC would first issue a number of allowances equal to the emissions cap. That's step 1, and that's the cap on the top of the screen. Second, we would identify the amount of emissions that are associated with non-obligated sources and sectors. That's the bin of allowances to cover non-obligated emissions on the bottom right. Of course, again, as illustrated by that red X, this quantity of emission allowances will be permanently retired by DEC and not available to obligated sources. Third, after the subtraction and retirement of allowances, only the remaining quantity of allowances, that's the bin on the bottom left of the screen, would be available to obligated sectors for distribution by auction or otherwise. While the exact order of operations has not yet been determined, this represents the conceptual approach, and we are soliciting your feedback about the details of this process. And as mentioned, including by Mike Sheehan in our Division of Air Resources in previous webinars, and as you'll hear again later, we do want input specifically on step 2 for the precise mechanisms of the process. That's the step for determining how that split gets made. So examples could be for identifying the amount of non-obligated emissions. We could estimate the amount of such emissions. We could utilize reported emissions data. We can incorporate a reconciliation or adjustment process or some combination of these types of mechanisms. Finally, on the last slide here, to sum up, non-obligated sources would not have an allowance compliance obligation under NYSERDA. Non-obligated sources might include aviation, direct emissions from livestock, and emissions from very small sources below an established threshold. But again, we have not made any of the final determinations on these points, and we do welcome input from all of you. Then we would take allowances to cover these non-obligated sources in their emissions, we would take them out of the cap and permanently retire those allowances. So don't want to belabor this point any further, but we do hope that these additional examples and illustrations help to describe this key concept of obligated and non-obligated emissions. As I mentioned, we do welcome additional questions and input, and we'll continue to respond to your feedback during this and future webinar sessions, as you're seeing with some additional, hopefully helpful explanation and graphics. So going on to the next slide, turning back to another key principle that I've been highlighting, which is really benefiting disadvantaged communities. So I mentioned how at least 35%, with a goal of 40% or more, of investments from this program will benefit disadvantaged communities. We are expecting that to equate to significant and much needed financial resources for these communities, including for pollution reduction strategies that might come out of the ongoing and parallel statewide community air monitoring initiative, which is another initiative under the Climate Act that DEC is leading. But in addition to this investment side of the program, we are also seeking feedback about any additional regulatory mechanisms on the cap side of the program that help ensure emission reductions occur in disadvantaged communities. So while this particular program, the NYSERDA program, is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we are also cognizant of co-pollutant emissions, and we want to make sure that this and other regulatory programs help to reduce emissions in disadvantaged communities. As laid out in the scoping plan, and in order to maximize the key principle of affordability, we do anticipate that the NYSERDA program will include some amount of emission allowance trading. We have seen that in RGGI and in other jurisdictions in existing cap and invest programs, and so we think that does help address affordability by keeping the overall cost of the program down. But the final scoping plan also highlighted potential mechanisms for DEC to consider, subject to ongoing engagement with environmental justice and other stakeholders, but other mechanisms for us to consider to ensure emission reductions in disadvantaged communities. And some examples of this that we are considering and that we're looking for input on include limits on trading of allowances for sources that are located within disadvantaged communities, or requiring additional allowances for sources located within disadvantaged communities. So with that, I want to give everybody a reminder on the next slide that the information presented today and in past webinars can be viewed on the website, capandinvest.ny.gov. We do plan to answer substantive questions at the end of this presentation. We might not be able to get to all the questions, but we are always taking comments and input on that website. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ona Papageorgiou, who's the Chief of the Mobile Source and Climate Change Planning section in DEC's Division of Air Resources. Ona will describe some of our starting parts for consideration and some of the other key program design decisions. Ona?
Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. John has shared a lot of important background information and context. After taking all of that in, you can see that the NYSERDA program is intended to be truly economy-wide. The scope of New York's program will be more encompassing than other jurisdictions. So what are the starting points to this type of program, such an ambitious program? We look to our sister agencies and other jurisdictions to begin. And we're seeking your input on what elements of those other jurisdictions' programs can be leveraged for use in New York. While we're highlighting California as well as Washington and the Quebec programs here, as John noted, this is not intended to be exclusive. We welcome input on related elements of any and all jurisdiction programs. New York's greenhouse gas emissions are generated from a variety of sectors and sources, as described in our annual greenhouse gas report. And the decisions made in other jurisdictions may or may not be the best fit for New York. There also may be program design elements in each of the other programs that are universally best practice and that will work equally well in New York. While today our focus is on liquid fuels, we welcome feedback through our webpage on all aspects of this work and effort. So as we go on to the next slide, here we describe a number of program design decisions that are under development. And I'll hit on the highlights of each of these on this slide, and then follow up with in-depth slides. Applicability and threshold will define the who and under what emission or operational circumstance the regulations apply. As noted earlier, this may be different for cap and invest than for mandatory reporting. Allowance allocation provisions will identify how allowances are created and assigned to accounts, whereas the auction provisions will establish the mechanism for how allowances are anticipated to be made available to compliance entities. The cap will establish the number of allowances to cover the annual emissions under the program, while the budget will set the number of allowances available for compliance entities. John went into a lot of detail on that. And also remember, the cap or full annual emissions will need to decrease to meet the 2030 and 2050 limits defined in the CLCPA and Part 496. Program stability provisions are mechanisms in which the availability of allowances could change in response to unanticipated events. Compliance and enforcement provisions will describe how and when obligated entities will surrender allowances for their emissions, and then what happens if they do not comply. Lastly, reporting and verification provisions will establish the emissions reporting and verification requirements of this program. So now let's dig a little deeper into the design elements, starting with applicability and thresholds. Applicability will explain which sources may or may not have to obtain and surrender allowances under a cap and invest program. Thresholds establish when the program applies, and this may be determined by emissions level or operational criteria. Different applicability and thresholds may apply to different source sectors. And that is me doing a little stretch to turn on the lights. Apologies for the distraction. Throughout the rest of this presentation, we're trying to remain focused on considerations related to emissions associated with liquid fuels. Certain specific examples may be given. This is not an indication that these are the only issues we want to hear about. Additional considerations about emissions and operational criteria not specifically identified are always welcome. In addition to the general definitions provided here, the state would like feedback on which level to set the applicability of multiple sources. Should it be at the facility level or at every emission point? Facility level could mean an entire building or plant under contiguous common ownership. Thresholds calculated from combustion would include upstream out of state, process, vented, and fugitive emissions. There are other types of thresholds which may be considered, such as throughput. We are looking for comment on how best to establish thresholds for this sector. Next, I'm going to go into specific questions for sectors that may initially appear to be unrelated to liquid fuels. While it may not appear direct, there is a node where liquid fuels enter these sectors for use, and I want to be sure that we're covering all of that. So prepare yourselves. I'm going to start peppering you with even more questions. While some questions may be directly related to fuels, others will be based on users of those fuels. So for electricity, what considerations should be evaluated for the electricity sector? The existing Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI program, is a multi-state cap and invest program for the electric power sector. RGGI covers CO2 emissions from fossil fuel-fired power units that are 15 megawatts or larger. Should RGGI serve as a compliance mechanism under the CLCPA? Should electricity be covered under NYSERDA? Or should it be covered under a combination of both? What considerations should be evaluated for establishing the compliance requirements for liquid fuels utilized by energy generating facilities? Are there unique fuel supply characteristics that can inform the establishment of applicability or thresholds? Additionally, what should be considered when evaluating how to address non-CO2 emissions and upstream out-of-state emissions due to fuel utilization at electric generating facilities? We also have questions about data availability, such as what information about the source of liquid fuels can suppliers provide? What information about the infrastructure serving this sector can be provided by the infrastructure owners? What considerations related to liquid fuels should inform discussions about addressing emissions from imported power? Are there specific considerations for emissions from RGGI sources outside of New York? What consideration should be given to non-RGGI electricity generators? What consideration should be given to having emissions from liquid fuel utilization at non-RGGI electricity generators? Or should that be part of the fuel supplier's obligation? Let's move on and talk about energy intensive and trade exposed sources. Energy intensive and trade exposed, or EITE, may be used to define a facility or facilities in New York that use large amounts of energy or fuels and are more exposed to cost competition outside of the state than other sources. Some examples may include cement, steel, and paper manufacturers. What should the state consider when establishing regulatory definitions for EITE facilities? What consideration should be given to liquid fuels infrastructure as a potential EITE facility? What should be considered when establishing thresholds for potential EITE facilities, and which emissions should be compared to this threshold? Combustion emissions are the result of burning fuels. Upstream out-of-state emissions are the emissions associated with the production and transportation of fossil fuels used in New York. Process emissions are created from non-fuel combustion operations at a facility. Should all these be considered? Moving on to other stationary sources. Stretch again. And in determining applicability, what considerations should be given to emission sources at large commercial and residential buildings that combust fuels for water and space heating? What should be considered when determining whether the facility or the fuel supplier should should have the allowance obligations for the combustion and upstream emissions? Should there be considerations for facilities which receive fuels by interstate pipeline? Should these considerations be separate from fuels purchased from other fuel suppliers? And are there any guiding ideas the state should consider about determining applicability in the fuel sector? What should be considered when establishing an emissions-based threshold compared to an operational threshold? Does either type or threshold provide greater clarity on allowance requirements? So now we'll dig into the waste sector. Emissions are produced from a diverse group of sources in the waste sector. These may include, but are not limited to, landfills, exported waste, waste combustion, and wastewater treatment. What considerations should be given to determining how the emissions from the utilization of liquid fuels at a landfill, digester, or other treatment facility are designed? Should the emissions be assigned to the facility or fuel supplier? When considering the thresholds, how might fuel utilization be incorporated into the emissions calculation? Fuels being considered for cap and invest may include fuels used for heating and transportation. Fuel suppliers are anticipated to have allowance obligations for all non-aviation fuel delivered to end users in the state. And it's anticipated that they'll have allowance obligations for both emissions from combustion of the fuel and for the upstream out-of-state emissions from the production and delivery of that fuel. Individual end users are not anticipated to have allowance compliance for these fuels, as John stated earlier. The compliance obligation associated with fuel consumption at EITE, other industrial or power generation facilities, may be covered by those facilities rather than by the fuel suppliers. This may be due to the facility being the first owner of the fuel within the state, or considerations about how the cap and invest program interacts with the RGGI program. What should be considered when structuring applicability so that the obligation for the fuel consumed at a facility is clear to both the facility and the fuel supplier? How should the applicability be structured for fuels delivered by interstate pipeline or by barge, where the fuels are not owned in-state before received by a facility? What tracking and reporting characteristics and systems exist to identify fuel supplier and facility fuel ownership? New York has very complex fuel distribution, a very complex fuel distribution system. What consideration should be given to establishing applicability and thresholds to incorporate fuel imported into New York, which does not pass through a terminal rack in New York? What considerations should inform the establishment of thresholds for liquid fuel suppliers? What insight should be taken from California and Quebec, setting different thresholds for transportation fuel suppliers? Each of them have different thresholds, to be more clear. So I've certainly asked a lot of questions, and we're going to go to the next slide where we get to remind you where you can view some of these questions on the capandinvest.ny.gov site. And from here, I would now like to turn it over to Mike Sheehan, who is the director of the Air Quality Planning Bureau in our own DEC's Division of Air Resources. He'll describe some of our and thank you very much, Mike. Goodbye from me.
Thank you. I will continue the more detailed discussion started by ONA by first discussing allocation of allowances. Once we have established the compliance obligations or determined applicability and set thresholds, we will need to determine how to allocate allowances under the program. Before an allowance can be turned in for compliance, the allowances must be generated by the state and distributed to the market. We anticipate the primary mechanism for allowance distribution under the NICE will be through auction. In addition, set-asides may be established for the distribution of allowances to EIT sources and separate set-asides established to support allowance retirement by the state for non-obligated sources discussed previously. As explained earlier, and to clarify some questions we received during our initial webinars, earlier this week and last week, retirement means allowances are permanently deducted and never again available in the marketplace to cover emissions. The total allowances generated by the state in a year is anticipated to equal the cap. Should other methods of allowance distribution be considered as we move forward with the development of the program? On this next slide, I will discuss the allowance cap. The allowance cap establishes the overall limitations of the program and will be designed, as previously discussed, to align with the Climate Act emission limits in 2030 and 2050. In setting these limitations, we will need to determine the starting year and starting cap level of the program. The current greenhouse gas inventory is generally published 2 years after the end of the inventory year. Last year's publication in 2022 represented the 2022 inventory of emissions. Should this information be used to set the starting cap at the most recent inventory emissions level? Should average of emissions over multiple years, or should the cap be informed by available data trends or analysis? Should we consider other options for liquid fuels? In determining the cap decline from that starting point to the Climate Act emissions limits, should we consider a linear trajectory as shown in an earlier slide, or should reductions be aligned with a step down period that might reflect the timing of other emission reduction strategies? This next slide will serve as a refresher on non-obligated sources. As mentioned earlier, to ensure this program is truly economy-wide and to ensure achievement of the Climate Act statewide emission limits, in addition to obligated sectors and the associated requirements mentioned above, the state will need to retire allowances for all non-obligated emission sources and sectors. Ensuring that these emissions are estimated accurately is important. To address non-obligated emission, the state is considering the establishment of set-aside or set-asides that would include calculation methods in addition to language on how and when the allowances for non-obligated emissions are to be retired. To reiterate, retired allowances are permanently deducted from the system and not available for obligated sources to cover. It is anticipated that emission calculation methods for non-obligated sources would be aligned with the methods in the greenhouse gas inventory or be informed by state-specific reporting. The set-asides may need to be established well in advance of actual activity data information used to calculate emissions based on the best available inventory data. To better inform the creation of the set-aside, we are looking for feedback on how the set-aside should be designed, whether there should be mechanisms to adjust the number of allowances based on annual data, and what data should inform these adjustments. In addition, if non-obligated emissions are larger or smaller than the set-aside in any year or series of years, where should additional allowances come from or flow to, if at all? Lastly, what consideration should there be on timing the retirement of non-obligated emissions compared to the compliance deadlines for obligated sectors and their emissions? This next slide will look again at the term allowance budget. As noted earlier in the presentation, the allowance budget sets the number of allowances available for compliance entities. It represents the total available number of allowances for sources to acquire at auction or direct allocation from a set aside. Non-obligated allowances, while covered under the economy-wide cap, would not be part of the allowance budget. These allowances would be retired by the state and come out from under the cap. The annual cap, again, as mentioned earlier, is the sum of non-obligated allowances plus the allowance budget in any year. In this next slide, I want to introduce the concept of program stability mechanisms. These mechanisms could be incorporated into the program to add or remove allowances under certain market conditions and used to establish criteria for the holding of those allowances. A cost containment reserve, if established, could be designed to provide additional allowances at an auction if the price becomes higher than anticipated. What information should be used in the determination of the price that additional allowances become available? Where should those allowances come from? A tranche of allowances under the cap? From future years? Should there be multiple price tiers? What information should be used to determine how large a CCR could be? Should it be a percentage of the cap or budget? Modeled amount to meet specific price point? We're really looking for your feedback on these mechanisms. An emission containment reserve, if established, would withdraw a number of allowances at auction if the price fell below a specific value. What should inform the determination of this price point? Should the ECR be the same size as the CCR? Should the design mirror the design of the CCR? Banking refers to retainage of allowances by market participants beyond the near-term compliance needs. There may be a variety of economic or planning decision sources or market participants take to decide if they maintain a bank of allowances. What information should the state consider when determining the impact of banking? A banking adjustment could remove allowances from future auctions. Should a banking adjustment be considered? If so, what consideration should go into establishing a banking adjustment, and what should trigger that banking adjustment? This next slide is meant to touch on the compliance process. Compliance under a cap and invest program refers to the surrendering of allowances for retirement for each ton of emissions from a source. A multi-year compliance period may offer flexibility to sources needing to acquire allowances to cover emission fluctuations when compared to a single-year compliance period. In this example, at the end of a multi-year compliance period, all 3 years worth of emissions would have to be covered by allowances at the end of the 3rd year. An option to consider, similar to RGGI, is that during the preceding 2 years of a 3-year compliance period, part of the emissions would have to be covered in what is called an interim compliance obligation. Multi-year compliance periods are utilized. What percentage of emissions should have a compliance obligation in the interim year? What information should be considered when establishing the compliance date? Should the compliance date be the same for all emission sources? Should any consideration be given to the timing of the compliance date and auctions? Is there need for a substantial time between reporting deadlines on the compliance date? I'll conclude my portion of the presentation by asking you some additional questions about enforcement mechanisms under the program. Enforcement and penalties are key components of any regulatory program and would be utilized in a cap and invest context when a source fails to surrender the necessary number of allowances to cover their emissions. What should be considered when establishing penalties for this program? Should monetary and the surrender of additional allowances be considered as penalties? How might these different type of penalties be structured? And this will go to the next slide. Again, I want to remind our audience The information presented today and in past webinars can be reviewed on the Cap and Invest website. I will conclude my presentation and turn it over to Nathan Putnam, professional engineer in the Bureau of Air Quality Planning and DEC's Division of Air Resources. Nathan?
Great, thank you, Mike. Okay, now I'll go through the reporting design elements we're seeking comment on. Again, similar to the Cap and Invest regulation described earlier, applicability and thresholds will also need to be established to determine what entities are subject to the greenhouse gas reporting requirements. The reporting regulation is expected to include a robust description of all emission factors and activity data requirements for all reporting entities. Reported emissions and activity data are anticipated to be used to establish emissions for compliance with the Cap and Invest regulation. Reporting may also support the calculation of non-obligated emissions and improvements to the statewide greenhouse gas inventory. These applicability and thresholds for the reporting regulation may be different than those in the Cap and Invest regulation, and there may be entities that have reporting requirements but have no allowance requirements. Several emission sectors are highlighted in this presentation, and today's focus on liquid fuels does not mean that there are other emission sectors which would not have reporting requirements. Next slide, please. What should be considered when establishing reporting requirements? What, if any, emissions information or activity data can be extracted or leveraged from existing regulatory programs? What should the state consider when evaluating whether to develop plain language requirements in this reporting regulation compared to incorporating by reference another program's reporting requirements? If benchmarking provisions are utilized in the Cap and Invest program as part of considerations on how to allocate certain allowances, such as the EITE allowances, how might these benchmarks be constructed? Should the benchmarks be based on international best practices or each facility's performance? How might past facility performance be used to establish emissions intensities? And what should be considered to determine the liquid fuel supplier reporting requirements to inform facility emission calculations? What should be considered when establishing how often sources report emissions and whether all sources have the same reporting schedule? Third-party verification of emissions reports and activity data may be required for most, if not all, sources. What should be considered when setting verification requirements? How might thresholds or compliance with the Cap and Invest regulation be used to determine verification requirements? How often should emissions reports and activity data be verified? And what considerations should inform the establishment of that verification timing? What steps should be taken to ensure emission verifiers understand the particular requirements of the NICI program and have the capacity to responsibly verify emissions? Should verification training be provided, or is an application for accreditation sufficient mechanism to indicate verifiers understand program requirements? And are there any special considerations for liquid fuel suppliers that should inform verification requirements? On to the next slide. As described earlier, the EITE concept may be used to define a facility or facilities in New York that use large amounts of energy or fuels and are more exposed to cost competition outside of the state than other emission sources. Applicability in reporting regulation is anticipated to be similar to the applicability in the Cap and Invest for EITE sources. What should be considered when establishing emissions thresholds for reporting at these facilities? And is there value in identifying EITE facilities that have emissions below the cap and invest threshold? Combustion emissions, upstream out-of-state emissions, and process emissions are anticipated to be reported by the facility. What operational or production data should be reported and utilized to support allocation of EITE allowances in compliance with the Cap and Invest program? How should fuel suppliers identify emissions associated with EITE facilities? What considerations should be given to having both the EITE facility and the fuel supplier report emissions and activity data related to the fuel utilization and fuel supply? How might specific reporting by liquid fuel suppliers be used to inform the calculation of these emissions at a facility? On to the next slide. Under existing cap and invest programs, electricity generators typically report certain data aligned with EPA reporting requirements under Part 75 and Part 98. To align with the requirements of the NICI program, how should electric generating facilities with RGGI source units report their emissions and fuel utilization? What consideration should be given to utilizing data from one or more existing reporting programs to support the greenhouse gas reporting requirements in New York? Are there unique considerations which should be applied to liquid fuel suppliers so that they can inform emissions calculation at an electric generating facility? Upstream out-of-state emissions are anticipated to be identified through fuel use reporting at the facility level. How should considerations of potential differences between RGGI source unit fuel utilization and facility fuel utilization be incorporated into the reporting requirements? What consideration should be given into the reporting regulation to allow fuel suppliers to identify fuel delivered to RGGI sources? How should the reporting regulation incorporate facility identification of its fuel supplier? What should be considered when evaluating reporting requirements for imported power? Should NERC e-tags be used to identify facility-specific information? What consideration should be used to evaluate if the reporting emissions at regional emissions rates is appropriate? If imported power is from a region with a greenhouse gas emissions trading program, how should that power be identified? And how should those emissions be reported by the importer? And should liquid fuels suppliers have any reporting requirements to inform these emissions calculations? Next slide, please. To ensure emissions from fuels utilized in New York are correctly identified, reporting of all liquid fuel distributors from the terminal rack to the point of sale to the end user may be necessary. Individuals and households are not anticipated to have reporting requirements. What reporting information should be considered to properly track all liquid fuels used in New York? What existing data reporting systems could inform these considerations? There are no fossil fuel refineries in New York. What consideration should inform the development of the reporting to account for fuels utilized in New York, which come from a very diverse group of fuel suppliers? What considerations should inform the establishment of upstream out-of-state emission factors related to the extraction and transmission of liquid fuels? And how might these emission factors be informed by the fuel supplier reporting? What considerations should inform the emissions reporting thresholds of this sector? Next slide, please. What should be considered when establishing reporting requirements to properly identify emissions associated with stationary sources and emissions associated with fuel suppliers. What should be considered when developing reporting requirements to address fuel diversions taking place between the terminal rack and the point of sale to an end user? What considerations should inform the setting of reporting deadlines? What amount of time should be given for reporting deadlines to allow informed decisions about allowance compliance? Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, New York is reviewing existing cap and invest and greenhouse gas reporting programs in other jurisdictions. Highlighting the California reporting regulation does not indicate a preference for its report regulatory text. These next slides identify portions of the California reporting rule, which may be helpful points of reference to formulate considerations for the New York program. In the California Air Resources Board, Subarticle 1, there are general terms on applicability and threshold for the mandatory reporting rule. Are there any considerations here which New York should take special notice of? Next slide, please. In the California Subarticle 2, there are specific provisions for suppliers of transportation and heating fuels, among other sources. This is an area where provisions of the California regulation could be identified and used to inform New York's program. While there are no fossil fuel refineries in New York, how might California's requirements for position holders and suppliers of fuel outside of the bulk transfer and terminal system be considered for comparison with New York's liquid fuel suppliers? Additionally, we would welcome your thoughts on how provisions of the US EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program are utilized in the California regulation, and if these elements would be applicable to New York's emission sources. Next slide. California's Subarticle 3 contains additional reporting requirements. Like other portions of the California reporting regulation, there are many references to the US Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, Part 98. This subarticle contains requirements related to calculating emissions from missing data. Should there be special considerations related to these provisions for New York's liquid fuel suppliers? What additional considerations can inform our understanding of how this regulatory text can inform the New York program? Next slide. Subarticle 4 identifies verification and accreditation provisions. What should be considered when evaluating this language and the needs of New York's program? What should be considered when establishing verification requirements for liquid fuels suppliers? How might the diversity of liquid fuel suppliers in New York influence verification requirements? On to next slide. Subarticle 5 identifies the infrastructure reporting requirements. What should be considered for New York when establishing similar provision? Again, while there are no fossil fuel refineries in New York, what consideration should be given to other petroleum supply infrastructure? And what type of provisions are not needed in New York? Again, next slide. Appendix A of California's mandatory reporting rule sets default activity data and emission factors for petroleum and natural gas infrastructure. What should be considered when establishing similar elements in New York's reporting regulation related to liquid fuels as part of today's discussion? What consideration should be given to establishing emission factors which change over time, and what information should inform those updates? Next slide, please. In Appendix B of California's rule, there are specific test methods for emissions from specific sources. How might these be applicable to infrastructure in New York, And how might this apply to liquid fuel supplier? And I think going to the next slide, where we turn it over for questions. And I also turn it over to Sarah Osgood, I think, to help facilitate that.
That's correct. Thank you, Nathan. So we're going to go back and we're going to try to take the questions somewhat in the order of speakers to try to organize them just a little bit. So the first one's up, if I could ask John Binder to be available. We've got several questions for you. The first is, will allowances be tradable?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We do expect that allowances would be tradable. We obviously talked about how there could be some limitations on trading for certain sources that are located within disadvantaged communities, and that's something that we definitely seek input on. But generally speaking, we would expect emission allowances to be tradable, in part because we think that's one of the key ways that we can keep the costs of the program down while ensuring that we achieve the emission limits.
Thank you, John. Next question is, how will emissions from non-obligated sources be regulated? How do you assure their actual emissions do not exceed the amount set aside under NYSERDA?
So, good question, thank you. I mean, obviously the scoping plan provides a whole series of recommendations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This NYSERDA program that we're talking about is just one of those recommendations. It's certainly a very important one that's going to ensure that we achieve the emission limits overall. But if you look at all the other chapters of the scoping plan, there's a series of recommendations about all sectors of the economy, including sectors that we anticipate would be non-obligated and would have non-obligated sources. So there will be other measures to address those emissions. And in addition, by having this concept of obligated and non-obligated emissions, we have assurances that overall emissions will meet the emission limits statewide.
Thank you. We've had several questions on the timeline. So questions about what's the target start date for the actual cap and invest compliance obligations and auctions. Can you clarify that?
Sure. We anticipate that both compliance obligations for reporting and for cap and invest in terms of the allowance compliance obligation would begin in 2025. The specific start date for both is going to be determined through the regulatory process.
Thank you. Let's see, I think we've got at least one more for you. Will you utilize the same approach followed in the New York State peaker rule development when considering any reliability related concerns statewide or within a disadvantaged community in creating the NYSERDA program?
Yeah, I think the model that we followed with respect to the peaker rule, which is addressing NOx emissions for certain sources, and it's part 227-3 of our regulations, did address reliability a lot. We worked a lot with various stakeholders, including the ISO, so that's something that we're very cognizant of. With respect to this program, it isn't just reliability, of course. We're also very cognizant of impacts on disadvantaged communities. So all of these factors are going to be considered as we go through the rulemaking process, and we intend to analyze all of them as part of the supporting documentation for the regulations.
Thank you, John. I think that's all we have for you at this moment. Ona, if I can just ask you to be ready to perhaps answer this next question. What sectors or scales of emitters are envisioned to be exempt? And this is the plain English version for non-obligated from the questioner, from requirements to pay for emissions.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm actually going to first address the exempt. No emissions are exempt from what we're discussing here. It's a matter of who is going to be obligated to attain and submit allowances on their own versus the state doing it on their behalf for their emissions. But secondly, more specific to the gist of the question, that's exactly what we're looking for from you. We're looking for the sources, we're looking for feedback on what sort of thresholds should be established, the scale of the source. And those thresholds could look like emissions, it could look like a throughput, it could look like different things. So what sets of data are available that would help determine those thresholds? And also, if there is an opinion or data supporting sources either being having to purchase attain allowances or not, we'd appreciate any feedback that you have to offer on that. I know that John gave some examples, and those are some thoughts that we have right now regarding what is obligated and not obligated. But we're still looking for a lot of feedback in this arena. So thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Ona. That looks like it's it for you for right now. Mike Sheehan, we've got a couple that I think fall under your area of expertise. The first is, what enforcement mechanisms are envisioned?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. As mentioned during my discussion, we are looking for your feedback on what mechanism or mechanism should be used. One example would be the surrender of additional allowances for every violation of or failure to cover their allowance obligation, emissions and allowance obligation. Another could be monetary penalties. So please provide your feedback in that arena.
Great. Next question is, can you further clarify retiring allowances? Would this result in fines possibly to homeowners or farmers, or would the emissions just not be quote unquote counted?
Yeah, there would be two, as we've been describing, there would be two types of retirements in the program. For obligated sources, those that that meet the applicability requirements and exceed the threshold, those sources would be obligated to surrender allowances to cover their emissions. And those allowances would be retired permanently once that process is completed. For all the other sectors or non-obligated sources in the program, the department will estimate emissions for those sources and retire allowances on their behalf. There would be no obligations for individual farmers or homeowners.
Thank you, Mike. One last question on obligated and non-obligated sources. Will obligated sources cover non-obligated sources?
No. Obligated sources would only be required to obtain allowances to cover the emissions for their specific obligation, again, as determined by the applicability, the thresholds, and what we define that obligation to be.
Thank you, Mike. That is it for the questions that we have for you right now. Next up, Nathan, if you could be prepared to answer a couple. We've got several for you. If the department establishes thresholds for compliance obligations, say at 5,000 tons per year for a specific industry, would all such sources that emit less than 5,000 tons per year be considered non-obligated sources?
Let's see, I think that is conceptually accurate. Yes, they may have reporting requirements, but it really gets to understanding how those sources, if it's a specific facility, how those emissions apply to their applicability, and whether there's a fuel supplier that's supplying those emissions, those fuels that generate emissions.
Thank you. Next question is, does DEC or NYSERDA have a working definition of what constitutes a liquid fuel for the NICI purpose?
Yeah, I mean, that's a general term we're applying for this description. I think, we're looking at how other jurisdictions define terms in their cap and invest regulations. And we're seeking feedback on those definitions. We have a list of fuels in our inventory and other, GHG reports that we've generated for the Climate Act, and we'd really like feedback on what to consider for this program.
Thank you, Nathan. One last one for you now. Are you considering getting reporting of fuel use or emissions from both suppliers and users, like an EITE facility, in an effort to be able to cross-check reporting and or adjust an entity's obligations under NICI, depending on the decided point of regulation?
Yes, that's under consideration. We're very eager on the feedback from everyone today on who should report and what they should report to make a comprehensive reporting system.
Great, thank you, Nathan. I think that covers the questions that we have for you right now. We've got John Binder. We've got one for you, a follow-up one. Will the program allow offset projections, in parentheses, voluntary greenhouse gas reductions projects, end parentheses, which could be equated to allowances or greenhouse gas carbon credits?
No, we do not intend to allow for the use of offset allowances for compliance for obligated sources under this program.
Thank you, John. Mike, one more for you as well. Will there be enforcement mechanisms for non-compliance?
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, there would be some sort of enforcement mechanism. As just previously mentioned, that could be in the form of the need to require and surrender additional allowances, or it could be in the form of monetary penalties. And we seek your input on what would best apply for this program.
Thank you, Mike. It looks like we're catching up on some of these questions. Give me a second to see if there are others that we can address. Mike, it looks like we might have one more question ready for you. Will the set aside from the cap for non-obligated emissions sources decline over time? Will the other measures / regulations suggested in the scoping plan meant to apply to non-obligated sources be taken into account to reduce the set aside over time?
Yes, the cap, as mentioned in the presentation, covers both obligated and non-obligated sources and their emissions, and will decline over time. And as mentioned previously, the scoping plan recommends various other actions that the state will be looking at to reduce greenhouse gases.
Thank you, Mike. John Binder, for auctions, will non-obligated entities such as financial institutions, will they be allowed to participate?
That's one of the issues that we're seeking feedback from all of you on. That would be addressed most likely through the NYSERDA auction regulation that establishes the procedures for participating in the auction and in the marketplace. So we know that that's something that's addressed in other programs, including in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative RGGI program. So we seek your feedback on that question.
I think that brings us to the end of the questions that we're able to answer here. So I will now hand it over to Joe Berman, who's the Senior Advisor of Strategic Partnerships here at NYSERDA, to close us out with some reminder information. Joe?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. As Sarah said, my name is Joe Berman, and I'm the Senior Advisor of Strategic Partnerships for NYSERDA. So this brings us to the end of what we wanted to present here today. We shared this timeline at the top of the webinar, but wanted to show it again as a reminder of the process before us. This was the third in a series of webinars to outline potential elements of New York's Cap and Invest program and identify specific areas where stakeholder feedback would be especially valuable. So we're planning 2 rounds of pre-proposal outreach. Input received in this first phase of outreach and engagement will be used to inform development of a draft regulatory proposal. We'll then be seeking a second round of feedback prior to formally issuing the draft regulatory proposal for formal public input. The formal public comment period will include public hearings and additional opportunities for stakeholder input. Final regulations would address the formal public comments. Following finalization of the regulations, mandatory reporting, compliance, and allowance auctions would begin. If you could advance the slide, please. So this is the third in a series of 7 webinars that we'll be holding this month to prompt feedback on program design elements that the state should consider in the development of these regulations. Please join us again next week on June 13th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. for our next webinar, which focuses on energy intensive and trade exposed industries. It's been said many times over the course of this event, but it's important to mention again, all of these webinars will be recorded and posted to the capitninvest.ny.gov website. Any additional events will also be posted to that website as well. If you could advance the slide, please. So in terms of providing feedback, I'd like to reiterate that while we may not have answered all of the questions today, for those that have asked whether decisions have been made on any aspects of the program, those decisions have not yet been made, and we are following direction from the scoping plan, specifically Chapter 17, and from the governor's principles. Again, we encourage you to provide feedback to inform the regulations development, and you can do so by heading over to capitninvest.ny.gov and look for the Submit Comments button. We're also accepting written feedback, and you can send that to the Bureau of Air Quality Planning, New York State DEC, Division of Air Resources, 625 Broadway, Albany, New York, 12233. If you could advance the slide, please. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us for this event, and we hope to see you again for future New York Cap and Invest program webinars. Thank you.